Good morning, students. Today we are starting a chapter, Thinkers, Beliefs, and Buildings, and you have to kind of read the complete heading of this chapter, which is important. Thinkers, Beliefs, and Buildings, Cultural Developments, 600 years before Christ to 600 years after him. Now, students, you have to understand that that is clearly 1000 years. Uh, why are these, or why is this 1000 year a special one in the world history? Students, firstly, but before we get into it, let me say that this chapter happens to be the last chapter in your part one book. We have three books in your syllabus, so the first one is going to be complete. This is the last chapter. So if you haven't been paying attention, start paying it, because now it is just a matter of time when we would be having, once the school opens, we would straight away be jumping into tests. Okay, and if you have not been following what has been happening around you, apart from of course your Netflix and Hotstar, then you would be in serious trouble. So now coming into why are these 1000 years considered to be the most important when it comes to ideology, philosophy, ideas, spiritualism, God, faith systems, religion, all these things had started now taking an institutional shape. Guys, you have to understand, gods have always been there, in our consciousness, in our minds. That is, as a power which is much, much superior to ours, and and power where we would like, whenever we would rather like assistance or help, and when we seem helpless, they are the ones whom we seek help. Of course, that thought was always there, but you have to understand that thought in the early times, right from the Rig Vedic times, and in all the civilizations for that matter, it started just with the forces of nature. Because I have said this, that, if someone was dependent on, because when man was just a hunter or a gatherer, and then he started becoming a pastoralist into rearing of animals, and then farmers, then everything around him was about nature. Okay, so if he was living around mountains, for him that highest mountain was the god. That's what he believed in, the mountain god. And if they depended on, they lived in the hills, always looking at the huge expanse of sky for them, and everything was under the sky. So for them, sky was the biggest, and was the only god and the most powerful god. But for people who had been living on the river banks, who depended on farming for their livelihood, and not just theirs but also the livelihood of their animals, uh, for them, river was the god and the most powerful god and the only god who really mattered. So, students, you have to understand that in those, if man has always believed in his divinity and the forces of nature and the power of spiritualism, but that was mainly confined to the powers of nature. For example, students, if you actually go to the Rig Vedic times, the most powerful gods, as per the Rig Veda, were Lord Indra. Lord Indra, Devtaon ka Raja Indra, because he was the one who controlled weather. He was the man who, or the god who controlled the rains, right? Thunder. And naturally, a society which was about farming, which was about pastoralism, where the animals, guys, you have to understand that even if you were a pastoralist, your animals have to depend on grasslands to remain alive. They also need drinking water to remain alive, right? Even if they might not be growing something of their own, but they also need the blessings of mother nature, right, to remain alive. So naturally, even in the Indian subcontinent, in Rig Veda, he was the most important god. Indra, Varun, fire, the elements of nature. It was only when later the society started becoming more and more complicated than the gods, like, and the concept of the creator, the preserver, the destroyer, all that got added much later. These things were not there in the early times, right? And then the Bajrang Balis and the goddess Kali and goddess Durga, Murugan, Ganapati Bappa, all these things started coming much later, as we started involving ourselves with different occupations, different activities. Naturally, students, you have to understand, writing came to us much later. Reading, writing, these things came to us much later. So naturally, you can understand that the evolution of goddess Saraswati also must have come to us much later. So you have to understand that these around 1,000 years, some of the greatest of the thinkers were born around, not just in India, in terms of God, Mahavir and Buddha, but even in China for that matter. Confucius was also born around 600 years before Christ. Then even in Japan, Lao Tse, he was also born around the same time. So the whole, there was an enormous amount of churning, an enormous amount of thinking that was going on in different ancient societies, whereby all of them had now become or rather graduated. They had graduated from a position of when they were just hunter gatherers and they were pastoralists, and they were into where everyone was a farmer. He was growing something, I was growing rice, you were growing wheat, and ultimately we exchanged it as per my needs and your needs, and it was a barter system. All of We had graduated from all that. We had now started issuing coins. Now, what do you mean by trade, students? In a very Of course, it's economics and all that high stuff I'm not talking about. But what is exactly trade? Why does trade happen? You would say, of course, we all need to be rich, and we all need we have our demands, and someone has to be there as a supplier for those demands, and that's how trade happens. That's true, students. But the basic thing about trade is that supply happens when there is a surplus, right? Students, a trade is about surplus. It must have today, of course, it gets much more complicated. I might be producing or supplying something completely for the international market, in spite of something might not be having any domestic demand at all. And the classic case could be, let's say, diamonds. Africa is the greatest source of diamonds and the largest source of diamonds today, international diamonds. Now, do you think Africans have that purchasing capacity to buy diamonds? African continent happens to be one of the poorest on the one or on the planet. But do you think they are the ones who actually buy those diamonds? Clearly not. They are concentrating completely on the supply side of it, right? But then, when you have to understand, when you're talking about a time in which is 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, then trade started with surplus. I have something, I have something which is extra, and that extra I don't need, right? And that is gradually man started thinking, trade and commerce and all of that happened. Now man had taken care of where the next meal would come from, because in the early part of his civilizational journey, he was more about hunting today in the morning and then feeding my family in the evening, never going home empty handed, right? Whatever, whether it was fruits from the jungle trees, or whether it was some small animal or a large one, whatever, but it was never going home empty handed, right? And so that is why he had no time to philosophize about his place in the cosmos and his place in the galaxy and the planet and the universe, and all those questions completely eluded him. He did have a sense of divinity in him, about the concept of divinity, of course, whereby he probably felt that, yes, God, please ensure that I catch something, I am able to hunt something, right? But then that was it. Oh, jungle god, please give me something, right? That is how it is, guys. Even today, if you go to many parts of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and all these places, and even in Northeast for that matter, you will find a lot of people having very strong belief in jungle gods, right? Why? Because they still kind of go out hunting for small animals. And that is why every time they start their day, they pray to, oh jungle god, please give me something. I do not want to return empty handed. guys. So that is how everything evolved. Now once man had taken care of all these things, now he was assured about what would I get in the probably end of the day, and where the next meal has been, or rather would come from. Once he had taken care of those responsibilities and those, if I may use the word, and I would, those headaches actually, then he could start thinking on ideologies, philosophies, religion, spiritualism, God, divinity, everything, his place on this, the whole system around him. And that is what people like, and that is where other people like Buddha and Jain, that is Mahavira, and Lao Tse and Confucius, and a huge number of Brahmin scholars, all those great thinkers, that is where they come in, and that is how, and all those great ideas and philosophies and all those great concepts as well got manifested and represented in different monuments and inscriptions and statues, and yeah, there was a whole burst of activity when which started happening after that, because different people started representing all of that and wanted to substantiate it with in a three-dimensional form, whatever their idea was, because just rather than putting it on the paper and having it inside their heads, now they wanted to express that in a three-dimensional object. And whether you talk about the stupas, or whether you talk about the monuments, the palaces, all of that was a manifestation of that. And that is the reason why we would be this chapter is extremely important in that sense. Students, you have to understand this is a very important chapter, not just to forget about your only about your board, from a board point of view, but Buddhism, Jainism, these are the things which make India, you know and and a great amount of Brahminical thoughts contributed by a huge number of great Brahmin scholars. Whatever you are today, the kind of life I live today, somehow, one way or the other, they all come from us. The cultures, the philosophies, the ideas, the concepts of right, the concepts of wrong, all of that comes out of it. And that is why this chapter is about thinkers. Okay, belief systems, of course, and the buildings ultimately, how man, once he had taken care of the food and the shelter and the clothes and everything, now he could devote his time and energy and resources in actually giving it a three-dimensional and a life form, something that would survive him, something that would survive his whole generation, something that can withstand the vagaries of time for 300 years or probably 3000 years. That's what his intention was. Students, we would be actually starting this about I think the first topic is about a glimpse of Sanchi. That is about Sanchi Stupa. That's how this chapter commences, that we would do tomorrow. Thank you.